The mystery of the stranger's house. Sarah and Miriam, two sisters burdened by the recent loss of their parents, moved to a desolate village where their ancestors had left behind an old, decrepit house. The villagers called it the stranger's house, a place whispered about in tales of eerie happenings and long-forgotten horrors. The sisters dismissed these stories as mere superstition, determined to make this house their new home and rebuild their lives from the ground up. On their first night in the house, an unnatural silence hung over the place, the kind of silence that felt heavy, almost watchful. As the clock struck midnight, the quiet was shattered by the faint sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and unmistakably human, bare feet padding against the cold, wooden floors just outside their room. Sarah, half asleep, turned over and muttered, "It's probably the wind rattling something." But Miriam, who had been lying awake, her heart uneasy since they arrived, whispered back, "That's not the wind, Sarah. Someone's out there." Reluctantly, Sarah sat up. The sisters exchanged nervous glances before tiptoeing to the door, their breaths synchronized in shallow, nervous gasps. Miriam's trembling fingers reached for the doorknob, and with a creak that sounded far too loud in the stillness, the door swung open. The corridor was empty, bathed in a dim, otherworldly light. The weak glow seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once, casting elongated shadows that danced as if mocking their fear. "What's that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper, pointing to a faint stain on the wall. It was a dark smear, almost brown, but with edges that seemed to glisten under the light. Miriam took a step closer, the metallic tang of iron reaching her nose before she even spoke. That's blood," she stammered, her voice trembling. "It can't be. It's old," Sarah tried to reason, but her tone betrayed her unease. Her hand hovered over the stain, as though expecting it to move. Before they could investigate further, the light above them flickered violently, casting the hallway into brief flashes of light and darkness. Then, without warning, the bulb died, plunging them into pitch blackness. "Sarah," Miriam whimpered, clutching her sister's arm tightly. Her breath came in shallow bursts, and her skin felt ice cold. A sharp chill swept through the corridor, not like the natural cold of an old house, but something more sinister, something alive. Sarah fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she unlocked it and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the corridor, but the faint glow didn't bring comfort. It only seemed to amplify the shadows, making them longer, more menacing. "Did you see that?" Miriam hissed, her voice cracking. "See what?" Sarah swung the flashlight toward the far end of the hallway. "There's something moved. I swear I saw it," Miriam said, her eyes wide with terror. The light caught a fleeting movement, a shadow in the corner of the room, slithering along the wall like smoke before disappearing altogether. The sisters froze, their bodies rigid, hearts pounding so loudly it felt like the whole house could hear them. "Maybe it's just," Sarah started, but she couldn't finish. Her logical mind couldn't find an explanation for what they'd just seen. The air grew heavier, the silence deeper. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to make their next move. "This place isn't right," Miriam whispered, her voice barely audible. "We're fine," Sarah lied, though the quiver in her voice betrayed her. "Let's just go back to bed." But even as they turned back to their room, their nerves frayed, and the bloodstain on the wall seemed to follow them with its presence. Neither sister spoke another word as they lay in bed, clutching their blankets like a shield against the unknown. It was their first night in the stranger's house, and already the house had begun to reveal its secrets buried deep in its walls, waiting to be uncovered. The mysterious book. The morning was cold, and the light filtering through the cracked windows of the old house seemed weak, almost reluctant to enter. Determined to shake off the eerie events of the previous night, Miriam decided to clean. The house was vast, its walls and furniture cloaked in decades of dust, and the air carried the scent of mildew and something else, something faintly metallic. In a dim corner of the study stood an ancient, imposing bookshelf. As Miriam wiped the layers of grime from its surface, her hand brushed against something heavy and out of place. She pulled out a thick, leather-bound book. The cover was cracked with age, and at its center was an ominous, unfamiliar symbol. The symbol seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, almost alive. "Where did this come from?" Miriam whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah, who was nearby unpacking a box, walked over and peered at the book. "Maybe it belonged to Grandpa," she said, brushing it off casually. But Miriam couldn't shake the unease that gripped her as her fingers grazed the book's rough surface. She opened it cautiously. The first few pages were filled with strange, indecipherable writing symbols and patterns that made no sense. The ink seemed to shimmer faintly, as though it were still wet. But then she turned to a page unlike the others. It was deep red, as if soaked in blood, and bore a chilling message scrawled in jagged, "Angry letters, this house is not yours. Leave now, or you will become one of them." Miriam gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Sarah, look at this," she said, her voice shaking. Sarah glanced at the page and frowned. "It's probably some old prank. Someone must have been trying to scare the house's last owners." She tried to laugh it off, but her voice lacked conviction. Miriam snapped the book shut and set it aside, her heart hammering. But the words lingered, clawing at the edges of her mind. What did it mean by one of them? And why did she feel as if the book was watching her, waiting for something? That night, the house seemed alive with a sinister energy. The air grew heavy, and an oppressive silence settled over everything. Miriam lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Around 2 a.m., a piercing scream tore through the stillness. It was a woman's scream, raw, agonized, and echoing with unearthly power. Miriam bolted upright, her heart racing. "Sarah, wake up," she cried, shaking her sister. "What's going on?" Sarah mumbled, groggy and disoriented. Before Miriam could answer, their attention was drawn to the corner of the room where the mysterious book sat on a small wooden table. Its cover was trembling, as if something inside it was trying to break free. Slowly, the book began to open, its pages flipping on their own, each turn accompanied by a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from the very walls of the house. "What the hell?" Sarah whispered, wide awake now. The air in the room turned icy, and a whispering sound filled the space. It wasn't a language they could understand, just a series of chilling, guttural murmurs that grew louder with every passing second. Miriam, shaking but desperate for answers, approached the book. The moment she took a step closer, the pages stopped turning, and the book slammed shut with a thunderous bang. The force of it knocked the table over, and the book lay on the floor, still and silent, as if it had never moved at all. The sisters stood frozen, their breaths shallow. Sarah grabbed Miriam's arm. "We need to get rid of this thing. It's not normal." Miriam nodded, but a part of her hesitated. The book was terrifying, yes, but it also felt important, like a key to unraveling the dark secrets of the house. "I think it's connected to everything," Miriam said, her voice barely a whisper. "We can't just throw it away. We need to figure out what it is." Sarah didn't argue, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. The night passed slowly, the weight of the book and its message pressing down on them. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't finished with them. And deep down, both sisters knew the worst was yet to come. The haunted mirror. One day, while Miriam was cleaning the dusty old rooms of the house, she came across a large, ancient mirror propped against a crumbling wall. The mirror was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its edges were adorned with intricate, almost otherworldly carvings, and the glass itself had a peculiar foggy quality, as if it had been trapping secrets for centuries. As she wiped away the thick layer of grime, her own reflection began to emerge, but then she froze. Behind her reflection, faintly visible in the misty glass, was the shadow of a woman. Her breath caught. She turned sharply, expecting to find someone standing behind her. The room, however, was empty, eerily silent, save for the distant creak of the old house settling. Her pulse quickened as she stared at the mirror, which now reflected only her own pale face. Grabbing the edge of the mirror, she pushed it back into place and ran to find Sarah. "You won't believe this," Miriam blurted out, her voice shaking. "There was someone in the mirror, a woman. But when I turned around, no one was there." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "It's an old mirror in an old house, Miriam. You're probably just seeing shadows, or I don't know, tricks of the light." "No," Miriam insisted. It felt real. Too real. Sarah dismissed her concerns with a shrug, but Miriam couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, the house was unnaturally still. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, making every creak and rustle feel deafening. Miriam lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts racing back to the mirror and the shadow she had seen. Around midnight, a faint rustling sound broke through the silence. It was soft at first, like leaves brushing against a window, but it grew louder and closer until it seemed to echo in the walls. Miriam bolted upright in bed. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, nudging Sarah awake. Sarah groaned. "It's probably just the wind." "No," Miriam said, her voice trembling. "It's coming from the mirror." The sisters turned to the far corner of the room where the mirror leaned against the wall. Its surface, faintly visible in the moonlight, seemed to shimmer. Slowly, a dense fog began to swirl within the glass, spreading like a storm cloud trapped in its frame. And then she appeared. The same woman Miriam had seen earlier emerged from the fog, her image growing clearer and more horrifying with each passing second. Her tangled hair fell in matted clumps around her face. Her tattered dress hung loosely on her skeletal frame, and her eyes deep, hollow pits dripping with dark, viscous blood fixed directly on the sisters. Her lips twisted into a ghastly grin that oozed malice. "Oh my God," Miriam whispered, clutching Sarah's arm. "It's her." The woman's bony hands pressed against the inside of the mirror, her long, jagged nails scraping against the glass with a grating sound that made their skin crawl. Slowly, she began to push through, her translucent fingers emerging from the surface as though the mirror were water. "She's coming out," Miriam gasped, her voice cracking with terror. Sarah scrambled to her feet and grabbed a sheet from the bed. Without thinking, she flung it over the mirror. The moment the fabric touched the glass, the scraping stopped, and the room fell silent. The fog receded, and the figure disappeared beneath the cover. The sisters stood frozen, their breathing ragged. Miriam clutched her chest, trying to calm her racing heart. What just happened?" Sarah shook her head, her face pale. "I don't know. But that thing, whatever it is, it's not just in the mirror. It's in this house. What do we do?" Miriam asked, her voice barely audible. "We need to figure out what's going on," Sarah said. "That mirror isn't just a piece of furniture. It's something else. Something dangerous." The following morning, with daylight offering a semblance of courage, the sisters decided they couldn't ignore the mirror. They had to confront whatever secrets it held. But as they pulled back the sheet, they couldn't help but wonder, who was the woman in the mirror? And what did she want? Unbeknownst to them, the mirror was more than a doorway. It was a prison, and its prisoner was growing stronger. The curse of Mahin, Sarah, and Miriam decided to uncover the history of their eerie home by meeting with the village elder, Bibi Zara, known as the keeper of the village's darkest secrets. Bibi Zara greeted them in her modest hut, her ancient eyes reflecting decades of untold stories. "This house is over a century old," Bibi Zara began in a low, deliberate voice. "Once, a woman named Mahin lived there. People in the village called her a witch." "A witch?" Sarah asked, leaning forward. "Why did they call her that?" Bibi Zara sighed, her gaze distant. She lived alone away from the village and never spoke to anyone unless necessary. Strange things were said about her, how lights flickered from her house late at night, or how she was seen murmuring under trees, her hands clutching strange objects. The villagers feared her, but no one dared to confront her. Miriam shivered and asked softly what happened to her. "A tragedy," Bibi Zara continued, her voice trembling slightly. "One day, a young boy in the village died suddenly. No one knew how or why. The villagers were consumed by grief, desperate for someone to blame. Then the village priest pointed his finger at Mahin, accusing her of using black magic to kill the boy. The sisters sat in stunned silence, their fear mounting as the elder's story unfolded. The villagers wanted revenge, Bibi Zara said. One night they gathered in anger and stormed Mahin's house. They dragged her out into the courtyard, ignoring her screams and pleas for mercy. They set fire to her house with her inside. As the flames consumed her, she screamed a curse. Bibi Zara's voice faltered, her words hanging heavy in the air. She cursed the house. Bibi Zara whispered, "Whoever lives here will suffer as I have suffered. This house is mine, and no one else will find happiness within its walls." Miriam's hands trembled as she clutched her knees. "Why did we buy that house? We need to leave. We need to leave now." But Sarah's expression hardened. "No, if we leave, that spirit will never let us live in peace. We have to face it. We have to end this." Bibi Zahra shook her head gravely. "Mahin's spirit is powerful, fueled by anger and pain. If you attempt to fight her, you must be prepared. Fear is her greatest weapon. If you let it consume you, she will win." Sarah nodded resolutely. "How do we stop her?" The elder hesitated before speaking. "To break her curse, you must find the source of her power. It could be an amulet, a book, or an object tied to her magic. That item binds her to the house. Destroying it will weaken her, perhaps even banish her for good." The sisters exchanged uneasy glances. They knew this would be no simple task, but they also knew they couldn't abandon the house. It was no longer just a home, it had become a battlefield for their survival. When they returned to the house that night, the air felt heavier, as if the very walls were aware of their intentions. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe, and every creak of the floorboards sounded like a warning. As they stepped inside, Miriam whispered, "Do you think we'll find it? The source of her power?" "We have to," Sarah said firmly. "We don't have another choice." But deep down, both sisters knew the fight ahead would push them to their limits. The house wasn't just cursed, it was alive, and Mahin's spirit wouldn't give up her dominion without a fight. And somewhere, hidden in the depths of this cursed home, lay the key to breaking the hold of a vengeful spirit. But would they find it in time, or would Mahin's wrath consume them too? The final confrontation, the night had fallen heavy and dark, an eerie silence blanketing the house. Sarah and Miriam stood in the center of the room, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on them. According to the instructions in the book, they had to create a specific circle in the heart of the house and burn the book within it to rid themselves of the spirit. "Do you really think this will work?" Miriam asked, her voice trembling with doubt. Sarah held the book tightly, her knuckles white. "This is our last chance, Miriam. We have no choice but to do this." The two sisters moved to the center of the courtyard, where a dim light flickered weakly. Miriam sprinkled salt in a perfect circle, just as the book had instructed, and Sarah placed the book in the middle of the circle. As soon as they began the ritual, strange noises filled the air, like whispers of laughter mocking their every move. "We need to hurry," Sarah cried out, urgency flooding her voice. Suddenly, the doors slammed shut with an unnerving force. The windows opened and closed on their own, and a cold draft swept through the room. The same woman they had seen in the mirror earlier materialized from the mist, her hair tangled and wild, her eyes pools of blood glaring at them. Her claws were long, jagged, and dripping with malice as she screeched, "This is my house. You must leave." Miriam's heart raced as she gripped Sarah's arm in terror. "Sarah, it's too powerful. We can't stop it." But Sarah stood firm, her voice steady despite the terror gnawing at her insides. "We can stop it, Miriam. Just burn the book." Miriam's hands shook violently as she fumbled with the match. The woman's long, skeletal hand reached out, attempting to snatch the book from the circle. Her voice, guttural and threatening, echoed in the air, "If you burn that book, you'll die with it." Fear froze Miriam's hand, but Sarah's voice cut through the panic. "Miriam, don't be afraid. She's trying to control us." Summoning every ounce of courage, Miriam lit the match and dropped it onto the book. Flames roared to life, licking the edges of the ancient pages. The woman's scream was deafening, a sound so raw and filled with rage that it rattled the house to its core. The walls shook, as though the house itself was alive and writhing in agony. The woman's form began to disintegrate, her body breaking apart like dust caught in a storm. Her bloodshot eyes wept tears that evaporated in the fire, and her face, twisted in a final, silent scream, began to fade into the mist. "This isn't over, I'll be back," she hissed, her voice lingering in the air long after her form had vanished. And then silence. The house was still. The trembling earth, the howling wind, the chaos, it was all gone. The sisters collapsed, exhausted, onto the cold, hard floor, their faces pale with fear and fatigue. Miriam's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "Is it really over?" Sarah let out a long, shaky breath. "We did what we could. But this night, it will stay with us. Forever." For the first time since the ritual had begun, the house felt peaceful. The oppressive, malignant energy was gone. But as the silence lingered, both sisters knew that they had fought a battle that would leave a scar deep within their souls. The house was safe now, but the shadows of the past had not been so easily erased. That night had been more than just a fight for their lives, it had been a lesson. To face fear, they had needed courage, conviction, and a belief in something greater than the terror that threatened to consume them. The house was theirs now, but the darkness they had conquered would forever haunt their memories. And though the spirit was gone, they would never forget the price they had paid to rid themselves of it.